Chapter 11, Saturday, July 2nd, 1775. A feeling of strong resentment and anger filled the gloomy silence of the huge Misikamiki at the little Miami River village of the Chalagatha Shawnee called Chillicothe. Blue Jacket was one of the 350 chiefs, sub-chiefs, and delegates of the 5 Shawnee septs who waited quietly for Cornstalk to speak. As principal chief of the nation, Cornstalk would be next to last speaker. The honor of speaking last, however, would go to Blackfish of the Chalagathas, in whose council house this meeting was being held. This Miskamiki was one of the largest in the Shawnee nation, measuring fully 120 feet in length by 40 feet in width. Because of its spaciousness, the large number of people inside now seemed not quite as big a crowd as they actually were. More than once, on other occasions, councils there had included upwards of 900 people. For many hours, the chiefs assembled here had risen one by one to air their grievances and demand greater freedom to retaliate against the whites for the treatment that they had been receiving from them. The trouble all seemed to stem from the peace treaty concluded with Lord Dunmore. While this treaty supposedly still permitted no whites to cross the Spele-Wathipi into the Ohio country, it definitely opened wide the Kentucky lands to them. It had been the crumbling of a great dam, which now permitted a flood of whites to swarm down the great river in every manner of floatable craft, from well-built boats to crude rafts. The whites had come like a plague of locusts, and whenever they stopped, they cut down the trees and burned the prairies. Worse yet, in the sacred hunting ground of the Kentucky lands, the whites were slaughtering the elk and buffalo by the hundreds, often taking the tongue or liver and leaving the rest of the carcass to rot. And they brought with them large herds of cattle and hundreds of horses, which competed with the game for the food which grew there. There were a great many noddings and grunts of approval when the war chief of the Shawnee finished his speech. Black Snake, who had been sitting on a buffalo rug next to Blue Jacket, had risen and spoken to the crowd not as the chief of the Kispokothos, but rather as the war chief of the entire tribe. His words had been angry and bitter. Only 2 full seasons have passed, he told them, since the Shawnese came, but already the buffalo seem fewer and the elk have become solitary and always on the alert and difficult to down. But that is not the worst. The worst is the men themselves who float down the Spele-Wathipi and shoot to kill whenever one of us shows himself on our own shore. Black Snake held up both his hands with his fingers spread and the thumb of one finger folded under. 9, he said angrily. 9 of our young warriors have been found dead on our shores since the hunger moon. 4 of our men have crossed to the Kentucky lands to hunt meat and never returned. White men have landed on our own shores and have tried to build cabins and have been angry with us when we tell them that they may not. They insult us and our wives and our children and our way of life. We are losing our dignity and our self-respect. Why? Black Snake demanded. Must it be we who turn our backs and walk away when it is we who are the injured? Why may we not, as we always have, repay in kind for what we receive at the hands of our enemies? There was a mumbled conversation after he sat down again, and even when Cornstalk stood, it continued for a while as a gradually dying buzz. For long minutes, the principal chief stood there without speaking, even after the chamber had become silent. At last his voice flowed out soft and sad, yet distinct to all who sat there. It's a bad time for us, yes. As with your war chief, Shemanito, the fire in my breast also wishes to burst forth in vengeance for the crimes which have been committed against us. I hold back in this desire, for I have given my word, as many of you have here, that we will remain at peace. His voice rose a little now. Do not think now or ever that Hokoleska so advises through fear, except that it is fear our nation will perish. If once again we begin war with the Shawnese, it will be the beginning of our end. The white man is like the worm, who, when cut in half, does not die, but merely becomes 2. For each one of them that is killed, 2 or 3 more, 4 others rise to take his place. Now he was appealing to their reason and trying to cool the hot emotions which filled them. As the treaty last autumn opened the dam to let the whites down the river in a flood, so now will warfare against them be opening a dam to permit them to flood into our country here and take it from us. It is no easy matter to tell you that we must not fight, just as it is no easy matter to bear the injuries being turned upon us. Yet it may be that if those injuries can be borne for a while, better relationships will come, and we will be able to live with the whites as neighbors. Many of the older members of the tribe nodded and murmured in approval at these words, but the undertone of exasperation, disgust, and anger became even greater for the younger men, especially those of the Chalagatha and Kispokothos septs. Blue Jacket himself felt revolted at the thought of any longer bearing the scorn and indignity, the injury and humiliation being heaped upon them by the whites. His voice was strong among those who growled with disfavor. Cornstalk waited until the interior of the Miski quieted again and went on. Yes, the young men are hard to hold. They want to strike back when struck, and it is not in my heart to tell them they are wrong. They are not wrong. But look deep into your hearts, each of you, old men and young, and ask yourselves if any personal insult or injury is worth the destruction of our nation, which any retaliation now must surely bring. With that, Cornstalk returned to his place beside Blackfish. As he sat down, the chief of the Chalagatha and his village of Chillicothe arose. Blackfish was not a big man, even though he was well built. He was no more than 5.5 feet tall. A queue of long braided hair hung from his head over his shoulder down his chest, and a wide band of beaten silver encircled his left upper arm. Blackfish was second in command to Cornstalk as principal chief of the Shawnee tribe, and as chief of the nation, it was expected that he would agree with the words of Cornstalk. But now he surprised them. Tossing behind them the queue of hair hanging behind his right chest, he tapped his finger to a large round scar that had been hidden by the braid. It was still an angry pink and had not yet healed, and it looked like a medal on his chest. "This is my memory," he said slowly. "It tells me that no white man can be trusted at any time in any place. It tells me that when I accepted injury and insult from the white man, believing it would not happen again, it became worse than before. The Shawnee," he cried, "must be able to live in dignity. We must not only demand respect of others, white or Indian, but even more importantly, he must be able to retain his own self-respect. He can never do this by turning his back on injury and insult. My memory," he tapped his scar again, "tells me this." He shook his head. "Hear me now. I do not say we should make war unless war is visited upon us, but I said we must protect ourselves. If our men are killed, we must kill. If our buffalo and elk and deer are destroyed, then so must the cows of the whites be destroyed and their horses taken from them. If our woods are cut down and our fields burned, then so must the cabins of the whites be burned. Only in this way will the Shawnee come to know that we will not allow our country to be ravished, our game to be slaughtered, our men to be killed, and they will think well on it before giving us further injury." With that rousing declaration, Blackfish sat down, and the large room virtually rocked with the whoops and howls of the large portion of the assemblage. Clearly, the trend was turning towards retaliation. But even those who whooped now were sobered somewhat by the memory of what had been said earlier in the council by the oldest leader present, the chief of the Talagila Shawnee, Kikaskalawa, had told them. The Seps have always been joined closely together in all important phases of Shawnee life. Yet I tell you now that the Thawagilas have their last war with the Shawnees. If just one more tomahawk is struck into the war post, the Thawagilas will leave the Shawnee nation and cross the great grandmother of rivers to the west, never to return. Chapter 12, Wednesday, May 15th, 1776. Blue Jacket, visiting XI-XII in Chillicothe, was impressed with Tecumseh. For an 8-year-old, the boy was unusually tall, very erect, quite good-looking, and remarkably intelligent. His abilities were apparent in whatever he engaged in, and he considered it important to excel. Tecumseh loved the games and sports in which he participated with his companions at Chillicothe, and listened carefully to the lessons received from XI-XII and others who taught him. More than a few times, Chief Blackfish had eyed the boy with pride and approval. None of the other youngsters Tecumseh's age were any match for him, and even those in early adolescence were hard to keep up with. His body was slim and solid, and his impressive young muscles ripped beneath his skin as he ran or swam, jumped or wrestled with the others. The boy could ride a horse expertly, and could shoot his little bow with the greatest of accuracy, even from astride his galloping mount. "You have taught him well, XI-XII," Blue Jacket said. "Pucks and Wah would have been proud of you both." XI-XII smiled and was pleased, but argued that his part in Tecumseh's development was small. "One cannot teach a stone," he said. "It is Tecumseh who must have the credit. He is the leader in all he does and among all the boys. When sides are chosen in the games, it is he who is selected as leader, and he always has a great company of companions about him, eager to follow him and do anything he suggests. And since you were last here, Blue Jacket, he has received his pawaka." Blue Jacket was glad to hear this, and pressed XI-XII for the details. XI-XII obliged him. It had been a clear, crisp morning last October when, as foster father, Blackfish had summoned Tecumseh. With solemn instructions, the chief had informed that it was now time for him to acquire his pawaka, that is, to become owner of some material object through which he could approach and receive power from both Moneta and the Great Spirit in times of need. He was sent to XI-XII's wigwam to strip himself, run naked from there to a deep hole in the nearby Little Miami River and plunge into it, then to return and dress. Each morning thereafter he was required to do this, right into the bitterest weather of the winter. As temperatures fell and snow covered the fields, the task became harder and harder to bear. Often he was forced to break a skim of ice in the stream before he could take his plunge. The frigid water and freezing air were a severe test of willpower and endurance, but his obedience had remained unshaken. He was being disciplined in obedience and reverence for the command of his earthly father, to make him worthy of receiving the protection and loving care of Moneta and the Great Spirit. In mid-January, on the morning of his final plunge, Tecumseh was informed by Blackfish that this time his preparation was at an end. He must now seek his pawaka symbol. He told the boy that this time he must dive deeply to the very bed of the river, and there to close his outstretched hand over whatever they touched. Without looking at what he grasped in his hands, he was then to return to Blackfish. This he did, and as he stood shivering with cold and anticipation, the chief pried open one hand and found some gravel and a piece of waterlogged twig. In the other there was a soggy leaf and some sand and a piece of white quartzite rock. Blackfish took the rock between his fingers and held it up. It was about the size of a pigeon's egg. He inspected it closely, turning it over several times, and then grunted approvingly. "This," he had told the boy, "is forever your powaka, to be carried by you and used as an intermediary between yourself and Munita and the Great Spirit when you are in need of help and direction. It will help provide you with courage and stamina, and most of all, with wisdom." It had taken Tecumseh weeks to chip a groove all the way around the stone so that he might tie it securely and wear it around his neck. He was sure that whenever it touched his skin, it gave him an inner warmth. "It is well," Blue Jacket said, nodding. He congratulated Tecumseh, who smiled shyly, and then ran outside. "And now," said Blue Jacket, turning back to Chick-Sika, "what is next for him?" Chick-Sika's own smile faded. "What is next has already begun. I have started to train him in matters of warfare." Blue Jacket grunted. That was good. Relationships with the whites had gone from bad to worse. With the outbreak of warfare among the whites themselves, no longer were the Shawnee able to cross the river openly to hunt. Those who did so were shot from ambush. But for such acts, the whites had recently been paying a heavy price. Though still advised not to do so by their older and more conservative chiefs, the young warriors had begun taking life for life, and in this they were being encouraged by British traders and Indian agents who supplied them with guns and ammunition for this purpose. Thus, when the Shawnee were killed, so were the white men. When elk and buffalo were butchered, so were cattle. When forests were felled and fields burned, cabins became ashes. Time after time, Blue Jacket had crossed the river, and time after time he had come close to losing his life. Already no less than a dozen settlers and border-roaming frontiersmen had fallen beneath his knife or tomahawk or gun. He was becoming known and deeply feared by the whites in the land which they were now calling Kentucky. Attacks against the settlements were becoming more organized, and in the past 3 or 4 months, Blue Jacket had led several of them. And the whites themselves were forming armed groups which could rise at a moment's notice to give pursuit under such leaders as Daniel Boone, Simon Kenton, John Todd, and James Harrod. "It is well," Blue Jacket told Chick-Sika for the second time. "There is not real war yet, but as surely as winter follows summer, it must come before long."